All right, I want to welcome everybody to our Energy Resiliency and Justice panel. My name is Brian Campbell. I'm the Executive Director of the Iowa Environmental Council, and we're co-hosting this together with 100% Iowa. That's a campaign that we're working on that's especially focused on carbon-free, clean, resilient energy for Iowans. So that's really the topic today, is to talk about that. And together with me is my colleague, Rehan.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I am Rehan Rashidi, and I'm a clean energy organizer for IEC's 100% Iowa campaign that Brian mentioned. Focuses on grassroots advocacy on equitable clean energy transition for Iowa. So yeah, I am here today, super excited to co-moderate this session with Brian, and also have our panelists join us today to highlight an important topic, which is energy resiliency and justice. Our speakers are doing great work in this area, and we hope to tackle some aspects on disaster recovery, community planning processes, distributed energy resources, energy democracy, and more that would help our audience better understand what goes into this work. We've seen that climate change is causing more extreme weather events that disrupt our energy infrastructure and overall livelihoods in communities. Last August's derecho in Iowa, and also the recent cold snap in February that impacted various parts of the country, caused prolonged outages, higher utility bills, food and water shortages, and more. Vulnerable populations such as low-income, disabled, and Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities face disproportionate outcomes as they lack resources to recover from these disasters and are often overlooked during decision-making processes. Now more than ever, we need to look into overcoming these challenges and finding opportunities on how Iowa can strengthen our energy systems and our communities to ensure that it is both resilient and equitable. So I am happy to toss it to our panelists and have them introduce themselves and give a little bit of background on their work. And I will toss it to Cristina Muñoz de la Torre, who is the Community Resilience Planner at Astig Planning. Go ahead, Cristina.
Thank you. So thanks for having me in this panel. I'm really excited to get to talk to all of you guys. I am Cristina Muñoz de la Torre, and I have 12 years of environmental and research and leadership in environmental and climate justice. Currently, I'm getting a PhD in disaster recovery, specifically looking at distribution of FEMA assistance with a lens on equity. So really looking at whether people who have been impacted by disasters, who are low income and minorities, are getting a fair share. And I've also been really involved in terms of locally here in Iowa, starting to survey Latinos across the state of Iowa and other stakeholders around what are the environmental justice issues that are important to stakeholders in Iowa. So I look forward to talking more about that.
Thank you, Cristina. I will pass it to Dolf Ivener, who is the founder of SunCrate Energy.
All right, thanks everyone for having me on the panel. And I want to say your backgrounds are very cool. I like the Iowa Environmental Council, 100% Iowa. I think to just jump into my background is I'm a serial entrepreneur. I'm a farmer. I'm actually right now, if you turn around, the tractor's in the background going. I traded a guy he's driving the planter right now. And we farm and we do solar installations and lots of different things. I'm working on a project right now with Iowa State with a grid resiliency, basically an off-grid solar system that is I call them nanogrids. And that's what I would say that's my specialty, a nanogrid. A nanogrid is enough electricity to power a house or a couple homes. And that's the specialty I've worked at.
Yeah, so I will toss it to Tamara, who is the Sustainability Program Manager for Linn County. Take it away, Tamara.
Awesome, thank you. And yeah, thanks for the invite to join you guys today for this conversation. So I'm Tamara Marcus, pronouns they, she. I'm the Linn County Sustainability Manager, as well as one of the founders and president of the Advocates for Social Justice, which is a local Black liberation movement group in Cedar Rapids. So, through kind of my own personal background, I've also been studying climate change for over a decade now, in the Indian Himalayas, in the Australian outback, and the Swedish Arctic. So a lot of that work has focused around not only understanding environmental change through kind of your standard physical science techniques, but also thinking about how we make that data more impactful and meaningful to the communities that could most benefit from those results. So for example, in India, I was working with local nonprofits, local government to use my climate data to support local environmental policy. So thinking about how we as climate scientists can generate actionable results and actionable data through building relationships with the communities in which we are working. So when I started at the county, I think, so for Linn County specifically, they passed a climate resolution in 2019, really committing the county to some aggressive climate action. So a lot of what you see in the Paris Agreement is also within this 2019 climate resolution, but really focused on emission reductions and not so much of how we prioritize communities who are disproportionately impacted by the effects of climate change. And so when I started this last August, it was a week before or a week after the derecho. So I accepted the position. A week later, the derecho happened, and then a week later, I started. So really, what I was imagining this work to be or what it would be, really changed very quickly. And this was, similar to the flood of 2008, another catastrophic natural disaster event. I wanted this to be an opportunity for us to rebuild stronger and more resilient. And so that really, in part, inspired the 2020 climate resolution prioritizing vulnerable communities. And so the idea of this resolution is to create a clearer roadmap for us as a county to reach those sustainability goals, while also empowering local communities and organizations who are most impacted by climate change to be the change makers, to be the voices leading that climate adaptation. So vulnerable communities as identified by this resolution include communities of color, immigrant and refugee communities, elderly and disabled, rural communities. So communities we know have certain and significant challenges to adapting to climate change. And then also tying communities together that we might not necessarily, that might not always get to work together, right? So rural communities and immigrant and refugee communities might be traditionally separate, but this resolution is meant to serve as a foundation for these communities to start collaborating together on the path towards climate adaptation within the county. And I think, why is this resolution important? Well, if we look at derecho, that derecho impacted every corner of Linn County. Everyone was affected by derecho, but that impact was not uniform throughout the county. You had people who maybe had, a few holes in their roof or just a bunch of trees to clean up in their yard. And then you had people who had lost their entire home. And so this is, in my opinion, one of the best examples that we can look to answer the question of why environmental justice matters. And so really focusing on how we can empower these communities to be the decision makers in climate adaptation and resiliency planning is the goal of a lot of my work at the county. And I hope that translates throughout other departments in our county and outside of it too. So again, thanks for the invite to be here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much. And Tamara, I want to follow up on you talking about that specific extreme weather event in Linn County that really impacted across the state in August. And I wonder if others of you, Cristina, you could maybe go first. I mean, what are some other disasters, extreme events like that, climate impacts that you've seen, that you've kind of learned from in the work you've done in the past? Other places where you think there's lessons that we can learn as we think about a resilient future here in Iowa?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think with answering that question, we have to first lay the ground and understand that climate change is happening, right? We have to first take that into consideration, and then consider, of course, the local, how is it going to impact? So just because climate change is happening, the impacts are different. So in Iowa, that means more precipitation, as well as also higher Fahrenheit and the impact that it will have. And so with those two things in mind, the number one thing is considering that we will not only have more types of disasters happening frequently, but also even at the same time. So we call that either cascading disasters when they happen like serially, or even compounded disasters. If you really think about it, derecho happened in a compounded disaster because we were still dealing with the pandemic. Well, we still are dealing with the pandemic. And so in Texas, we saw the same thing. There was that ice freeze over. So that's the cost of climate change, as well as they were still dealing with the pandemic. So my biggest takeaway is we have to start, when we're thinking about climate resilience and disaster resilience, it has to be considering all the types of hazards that we're likely to have, and even those that we don't typically have anymore, like as common, like the derecho. We should always prepare for them, because when they do happen, there's no way to be prepared unless you take into account that it would happen. So that's the biggest thing. And I think this is important because the way you deal with one disaster might require you to have an opposite kind of plan for another disaster. So when they happen at the same time, for example, again, the pandemic, you want to social distance, but then you have maybe the derecho that put a lot of people homeless for a while, and you're going to cluster them in a shelter. How are these two actions going to be solidified together? And so that can only be done with planning beforehand.
Yeah, and Dolf, I know that you've also, some of your work with energy storage, distributed energy, grew out of your concern about some disasters you've been involved in communities around the world, right? What comes to your mind as some, experiences, examples that we can learn from?
Nice. So I did a project with Black & Veatch, which is a big insurance company, and Tesla, and installed an off-grid system for a school in Puerto Rico. And so, it's very different. In the United States, we have like this robust infrastructure, even though people are like, oh, our grid is bad or it's failing, it's pretty good. And those people in those places, it's a very fine line on how good it works, even in the best of times. And so basically, what we did is we went through and we delivered a SunCrate box, dropped it off at the school, and made it so that you didn't need to use diesel power to keep it running before the grid came back. This goes back to my thoughts of a nanogrid, where you're responsible for your own electricity and your production, and you're not responsible for the infrastructure of institutions to work, right? So I guess we'll go back to that. So the problem that those people have, I'll say in Puerto Rico, is their institutions are failing them, just straight up, right? And what they're willing to accept from their institutions, we would never accept from ours. That would be a failure, and heads would roll. And societally, they'll accept it. And so one of those institutions that they depend on is electricity from a grid, right? And it's PREPA, so it's this big institution. It's, it's not highly organized. It's not very responsive. And if you deposited the people a nanogrid where the power is their power, right? What is its value, right? If PREPA is selling electricity for 17 cents a kilowatt, that's what they're 17 to 19 cents a kilowatt, and you're able to produce your own electricity and to make it financially viable, it's worth 21 or 22 cents, but it works all the time. You know, that's an awesome, right? That's an awesome model. We're, you know, Puerto Rico is the United States, and we're going to help them, right? Well, who are we giving all the money to? Who got all the money? What institution? We gave it right back to the institution that was failing them before, and we just handed them more money rather than saying, hey, why don't we rethink this? And instead of giving PREPA, you know, $8,000 per home, maybe there's a way we can give the money directly and they can produce their own power, right? Now, what I'm saying about doing is very revolutionary, and it's new because there was no technology to do that, but now there is. And all of those crazy electric cars we see driving around are fueling this ability to have cheap backup electricity, and solar panels are becoming so cheap. So I would argue that just like we had landlines everywhere, and you know, we said to people in third world countries, well, you got to build all this infrastructure, right? Well, who got the last laugh? We spent all that money on landlines. They put up some cell towers. Now we all have the same communication. And I would argue with you, I've been to some of those countries, they have better cell communication than I have, right? In the United States. So that leap, right, is where we're at. So like the cell phone leap, right? And how, as donors in the first world, when we give them help, how can we help them to make that leap and not fall into that trap is, you know, I don't know. I don't know how we do it.
Dolf, you shared a short clip with us on your project in Puerto Rico. Let's take a look at the video so the audience can learn more about the project.
Desde el huracán fue una experiencia muy triste y bien dolorosa para todos nosotros.
Horrible, pero gracias a Dios, después de la tormenta, los efectos de... se dañó medio mundo, pero estoy vivo.
Pues hoy tenemos la bendición de tener estas compañías que nos han donado este gran proyecto, que son unas placas solares para nuestra escuela y para la comunidad de Jácanas. No solamente para nosotros, ¿verdad?, como escuela, sino para que toda la comunidad sea, ¿verdad?, pueda beneficiarse de este gran proyecto.
The beauty of the SunCrate is that we can roll it out very quickly, and our hope is that we are going to be able to contribute to the transformation of the Puerto Rican power grid.
This system will help us be more resilient in a way that we'll be self-sufficient, and we will use the system in our school and in a special project we are planning to do this school year.
Pues los niños van a aprender sobre la energía renovable mediante el uso de las placas solares. Van a conocer directamente en qué consiste, cómo funciona y qué cosas puedo lograr con ella.
So, I mean, I help, and I'm also working on projects on the Navajo reservation. And I mean, if you want to hear about inequity, so we all got electricity in rural America during the New Deal, right? And they went through and ran power lines to everybody's home, even though it didn't make financial sense, but we knew it was a good idea. But when they got to the Navajo Indian reservation, well, they're like, oh, those people don't need power, right? They're not going to use electricity. And we're dealing with that where there's 12,000 homes on the Navajo reservation that do not have electricity, 12,000 homes. So maybe 40,000 people that don't have grid-tied electricity, all because of a decision made in the New Deal by FDR, right? And so, I mean, it's how we make that twist is a really good, we have this new technology. How do we use it smartly? And I'll put that to you guys, maybe. How do we use it smartly?
Yeah, I'll comment on that. It's a good point. It reminds me of, I forget who the quote is by, but if it's something like it's not revolutionary if it's not accessible to the poor or something. Like if it's not accessible to the poor, it's not revolutionary. So I think, that speaks to the exclusion of the environmental movement, specifically around renewable energy for decades. It's only just now starting to be a topic of conversation, as represented in part by this panel. It's exciting that it's happening, but it's taken so long. I think it's honestly this conversation around environmental justice and equity has really picked up since the Black Liberation Movement has really blossomed, right? So I think it's a testament to me and the power of intersectionality and thinking about how we not only make these conversations interesting to groups who have not been included in this movement, but also how we provide the resources necessary to allow these groups to access renewable power, to access sustainable food, to provide job trainings, right, to get more people trained to be able to take on these green jobs that are opening up. So I think that to me is the challenge for every environmental movement, any individual working in this space in government, right, is figuring out how we create better programs to increase this access and build this capacity within these communities. So it's a great point.
I want to, kind of get back to distributed clean energy resources and, kind of tackle what role distributed resources can play to create more resilient energy systems, and how do things like residential solar or community solar create new opportunities for equity and energy democracy, and essentially making sure that these resources are especially accessible to communities that have been impacted the most by climate change and not just the wealthy. So how do we ensure that the environmental and economic benefits are, can provide the potential to transform communities by redistributing jobs, health, wealth, political power, and more equitably?
Okay, so the way I see it is we have to depend on the utility structure to do it, because they have the ability to raise capital. So right now, the way solar panels work is that you get tax credits, right, for installing the solar panels. So private individuals, they come to your house and they say, all right, sign a power purchase agreement. So you're the homeowner and I'm the company. And so you can't take advantage of the tax credits for whatever reason, your income isn't high enough. And then I take advantage of your tax credits. And that model is working pretty good. Like, I don't know what percent. It started to become smaller because companies will now finance the solar. But the best model, you have to have financial wherewithal to do it. You can't do it on rental properties. Like there's just a list of things where it doesn't work. Where it would work the best is the utility owns the infrastructure at your house so that they are able to still make their revenue, help maintain it, right, and do all of those things. So instead of them saying, hey, we're going to build a giant solar farm out in the country, which is what they're doing, like in eastern Iowa right now, they just announced, 1,000-acre solar farm. Why didn't they put those dollars into putting solar panels on people's roofs, right? And they would argue with you and say, well, the reason why we didn't do it is we can put so many more solar panels out in the field than we can on the roof. It just costs so much more. Well, if you did a lot of them, like you do giant solar panels, you would drive the cost down, and the value of the solar power is worth more at the point of consumption versus in Yehovitsville, right? Like way out in the middle of nowhere. So when you have a derecho, the power can't come to the people's house. I think that takes the utility commission maybe to put more pressure upon them to say, hey, distributed energy that the utility owns is what we're after. And so that's, that's the thought. I mean, we do it right now, or we don't do it as much because it got gutted, but we had a great rebate program for lighting, for all of those things, right? And that was to reduce the consumption of electricity at people's homes, right? They could have gone through with the same amount of dollars and built a giant coal-fired plant on the Missouri River for probably the same amount of money, but it's just a better thing to do, right? So as I see it, that is the push. How do we get the utility to play on board to own distributed energy at people's homes? To have it viable financially, to have it the technology right, have all of these things. I mean, literally, we're 40 months. We're 40 months in an institution that is, when did the utility start? Right? Utility started like 120 years ago, right? So we're 2%, 3% of the time. And this is a huge sea change for them to look at it, right? So, but it's important that institutions and groups like you are saying, hey, this is the direction. This is the direction.
Mm-hmm. And definitely finding that balance between, improving our, regional grids and also making sure that these distributed resources are being planned, in the right locations and, yeah.
And let's also remember one thing, and this is a very important thing, and it's something we face all the time: cost. Right? If it's going to cost more to do distributed energy, we have to justify the cost, right? The rate, so, and that's thinking through what are the values, and this is why it's worth more money to pay an extra penny or two a kilowatt, right? To have it like this rather than, giant power plant pushing power at you, right? It's not apples to apples.
So this is something I'm thinking of it in context of, post-derecho recovery, because I think that this is, again, an opportunity to demonstrate why resiliency planning, why sustainability is important, period, and also for local governments to be involved in this work. So this belief is taking shape, is manifesting physically as a model that we're referring to as a resiliency hub model. So the idea is that this space will provide access to critical resources throughout the year, but then especially in times of crisis becomes exceptionally valuable. So those critical resources that we're starting with for our first site is, access to local and nutritious food. So we're partnering with Feed Iowa First, the NAACP Climate and Environment Committee, and the Salvation Army to build up a community garden structure and urban plot and also fruit trees to provide access to this critical resource, while also, taking advantage of resources in this part of the county that are currently in existence. So the space is near a mental health access center, so we're building in horticulture therapy. So again, working to create a space where there are a number of valuable resources accessible to the community. This also includes access to solar charging stations. So this, even though it's a small example of the value of distributed power, thinking back to post-derecho, you'd have people charging phones outside of the buildings that did have power. So thinking about how we better prepare the infrastructure for when the next disaster happens. And then also the third critical resource that we're starting with is actionable information. So this includes having 24-hour access to Wi-Fi, because thinking about lessons learned from derecho, so much information was being shared on Facebook, mostly Facebook, honestly. And so being able to access Facebook is a direct connection to information, into that valuable resource. And so the idea is to spend the time before the next disaster building the space as a known place to go to for these resources. So in times of crisis, when everything else fails, again, thinking about derecho, no one knew where to go, right? And so it was just this mass confusion of where do I even go for help? So building a space where people know this is where I go for help, this is where I go if I have something I can help with, is the goal and the objective behind these resiliency hubs.
Yeah, I would like to add to that. So I really like the way that Tamara is bringing up the need to plan beforehand and having that infrastructure. And along with that physical infrastructure, social infrastructure is really key. And so I asked earlier, how do you prepare for two types of disasters where the action might be contradicting to the other? And the answer is through innovation, through flexibility, and most of all, also through accessing that social infrastructure. So an example would be, for example, at Astig planning, we're doing actually a flood resilience action plan, right? And we're supposed to launch community engagement right before pandemic hit locally. And then again, we're going to do some workshops online, and then the derecho hit. So each time we have to really re-innovate, but most of all, you can use the resources that you had. So the resources that we had prepared for flood resilience, it didn't matter that it wasn't a flood. It mattered that there was a disaster and we had resources that we can use for the pandemic and for the derecho. So one example was we helped translate the library. There was already a partnership with the library that we already had established to do some of these workshops. And so when we reached out to them and they're like, hey, we have flyers that we're going to distribute for access to laptops and internet that a lot of people needed at the time, but it wasn't translated in Spanish. So I asked, do you have Spanish versions? They said, no. I translated it. We printed them out. We had already planned on putting in flyers for our workshop and in places that would be accessible to renters. So that includes laundromats, local grocery stores, marquetas, because we're trying to reach Latino and low-income population as well. So we partnered, right? That partnership was already there. Those efforts were already going to happen. So we took that chance to also post those flyers from the library. And so that's one short and very small, but still kind of illustrates the need for leveraging existing relationships, being really flexible and innovative. And I think especially for people who are already doing the work, so we were going to do some of the community engagement either way, but this way we could also have direct benefits to the community who needed something immediately, even if it wasn't exactly what we were supposed to focus on. But that's what I mean by compounded disasters and having that frame of thinking, resilience thinking.
Yeah, I really like how you emphasize the connection there between the physical infrastructure, whether it's energy resources like solar or battery storage, even whatever kind of backup power systems, and that physical infrastructure is vital, but it's only as useful as the social infrastructure, like you're saying, and the way that we need resilient community systems, networks of people that are adaptable and responsive and innovative, and because we can't always know what's coming, so we need the social and the physical infrastructure to be able to adapt. And part of what you pointed out as a planner, right, is that we really need to be thinking ahead about what kinds of risks we might face. What are some of the ways you think we can be preparing? What are the things that you're working on in your different roles to prepare for what's coming? How can we be more resilient in that physical infrastructure and that social infrastructure? And maybe Cristina, you can start by just saying more about some of the kind of planning processes you're part of.
I think some of the ways we can start preparing is definitely becoming more educated in terms of the different hazards that you're exposed to. And I think that's just step one. That's not the solution, but it's important to know that information. And so as advocates, we might want to be translating that information, sharing that information in our networks, making it very based on storytelling and very concise language so that people can they just need to know. If somebody moved in this month from the summer, so a lot of college students move in, they just need to know, like, we've experienced floods and we've experienced derecho, and it wasn't the first one. The first one was not the first one, but the last one was many years ago, but still, like, that's history that needs to be shared. And then second, building that local network is actually really important. So in my research, I do a lot of research I look at both social capital and social vulnerability. So Tamara mentioned vulnerability as being defined people who are elderly, low income, Latinx, Blacks, and Indigenous communities. And so when we are talking about, build that social infrastructure, get to know your neighbors, get to know the community service providers, my research shows that it's not enough to just build this like wide net cast of social capital, but you really need to know what kind of social capital you're looking into. So one way to categorize this is bonding, bridging, and linking social capital. Bonding being relationships with people who are very similar to you and close to you. So that could be your neighbors, your friends, your family. Bridging social capital is relationships with others who are different from you. That could be geographically, the relationship between residents in Linn County who might need support from those in Johnson County who weren't hit as hard by the derecho, right? It could also be different in terms of demographics and class and race. And then linking is particularly when there's difference, but also a power gradient. So that could be a resident with a council member relationship, or an applicant of FEMA assistance and the official providing that process. And these distinctions are important because research shows that different types of social capital are more important in different stages of disaster. So immediately after a disaster, your neighbors are going to be the most important. They're going to know if you haven't been walking around lately, you've been missing. They're going to know if you need water, and you guys can help each other. But that bridging really is important soon after the response. So when you're really looking at nonprofits responding, distributing resources, and then linking, of course, is especially important during long-term recovery. We're talking about federal disaster assistance, American Red Cross, FEMA, stuff like that. However, the last thing I wanted to mention is that not everybody has access to social capital, or all three of these. And so my research illustrates that low income and Black and Latinos and Indigenous communities are less likely to have the bridging and linking types of relationships, but are more likely to have the bonding type of relationships. And this has precautions about what kind of recovery resources they'll have access to.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cristina, for touching on the different ways that social capital can be like strengthened and improved. I want to go back to physical infrastructure and kind of direct this question to Dolf. And as we talk about being better prepared and having these backup power, can you talk a little bit more about battery storage? I know you have done a lot of projects on that that's paired with solar. Can you talk a little bit about those, the importance of having those kinds of backup power?
I want you to be really aware, it's not just during times of crisis, right? That is the beauty of distributed batteries and distributed solar. It has double value, right? And that's where I run into walls all the time with people. right? So I'm working with Iowa State and the National Guard. We have this awesome system that has a huge battery. It works off grid, it works on grid, it does all these things. Well, we don't have it tied to the grid, even though it would be great for the grid, because trying to get all the institutions to line up to say, yeah, let's do this, right? So I mean, it's a Yiddish word, it's a shanda, right? Like it's just a shame. It's a total shanda that I have this unit sitting there that can produce, 40 kilowatts a day, and I can't get enough people to come plug their cars in to take the power, right? And so when you go through and you take a Tesla Powerwall, an LG Chem battery, a Tesla Power Pack, and you put it in a neighborhood, when you have a grid failure, it can provide power, but also day to day, it can offset peak demand and flatten the load. And that has two purposes, right? And we need to put them both in there. And that's where, institutions like you need to say, hey, this is the value. It has double the value. And it takes the utility commission to push the utilities to say, hey, if somebody puts this distributed energy in, right, we want it hooked up and it has double value. So you'll have your battery, it's full. You say, all right, we never want to deplete the battery past 50% in case there is a disaster. So the utility is just using this battery every day. It's charging it in the middle of the night when electricity is cheap. It's using it in the morning when everybody plugs in their hair dryers and goes to work, right? It's doing a great job. And then upon disaster, boom, you don't have to worry, right? You now have power. Now, what seems to be happening is the utility wants to make a giant battery out in a field, right? And yes, that is great for helping offload peak demand charges. Awesome. But when you have a derecho and the line gets cut between you and the field, it just doesn't work. And so we have to bring them back again to placing these assets in neighborhoods is really important. Every substation should have one, right? What I really feel is, and there are utilities that are doing it, is they're subsidizing the cost of the battery in people's homes, and they do it in California. California had a big rebate. And if you put a battery in your house, you had to allow the utility to charge and discharge it at least like 25 times a year to take the rebate money. And those kind of things are amazing. I mean, it makes sense for everyone, right?
Yeah.
That got a little tricky because the homeowner was paying for it, so the utility didn't get to own the asset. And they don't like that so much. But you could do something where the utility also owns the asset too. All electrical cars will be bidirectional in the next 24 months. And if that is the case, trying to wrap your brain around the amount of electricity backup power that will be available is, and I study this all the time, and I run into a wall even trying to think through it, right? If every home has two electric cars, if you average 2 electric cars, each battery is a 100 kilowatt hour battery. You have 200 kilowatts parked in each garage that's completely interactive with the grid, which Tesla already does right now. I mean, it's already there. Holy buckets. I mean, what does that look like? Right? I mean, it's a
lot of power. Yep.
It's a lot of power. And it's like, how do you use it properly? And it's difficult for the utility because that's not their asset under management, right? That's not theirs. So they're not making money on it, but yet it should be integrated into their day.
So we've talked some about how extreme weather and climate change are, disrupting energy systems, how they're impacting different communities differently. I think implicit in that, we haven't talked about this a lot, but I think we've seen through the pandemic and through these extreme weather events how our political systems also have lots of vulnerabilities, and how people's trust in local government, federal government, state government is often really stressed by some of these same kind of disasters. And then there's things like food shortages or power outages that reveal the inadequacies of our local governments, our government systems, And that in the wake of these kind of disasters, Cristina, you talked about how all sorts of volunteerism, philanthropy, mutual aid, neighbor networks, all kinds of things pop up, and in some ways, reveal what's possible, like more democratic, more alternative kinds of social networks pop up, and sometimes those are stamped out pretty quickly and replaced with the kind of pre-existing government structures. But I wonder what you've seen in your experience, or what you think is possible, as we face more and more climate disruptions. Like, how can we create stronger social, democratic, just local systems like that? Like, do you see these kind of disruptions as creating opportunities as much as they're creating challenges? Like, how can we evolve that kind of local government, and maybe it's not just local. Over time, we've seen national institutions really transformed by disasters throughout history. But yeah, I'm curious if you see examples of that already, or what you see as possibilities.
Yeah, we definitely have local responses as a result of a disaster. And we have seen both organizations that stay in the long term and solidify, and those that don't. The biggest difference really comes down to leadership and support. But I'm actually for local organizations more than, not that there's no role for national and larger organizations. There is completely a role, and that role is of supporting the local organizations, and the leadership should be coming from the local organizations. And I think that's the best kind of dynamic, because the local organizations have an understanding of their needs. Like Tamara, I like that she says this a lot too, about the local organizations know what they need. They know the resources that they have and don't have access to. And of course, one of the things you mentioned is the politics and the relationships within communities. We say that term quite fluidly, but within each community, there's lots of factions. So that's where the role of people who are her community engagers, who look at diversity and inclusion, that role is key. And that is still not solved in national organizations. They are even less capable of understanding those local dynamics. So yeah, I think we see both organizations that stay in the long term and don't stay, but the fact that they respond is important.
Yeah, and I would say that, I think it's the job of local government to support those organizations, right? Because nonprofits typically just know how to do it better. The trust is there in a way that isn't really for local government. And I think that, is something that's certainly a point of consideration of how to build trust. And that's, thinking of just this Linn County Tree Equity Program, a big objective of that program was to build trust, to show that the county can support these organizations and provide them with something, and give them something, right? I feel like the relationship typically for county to residents is more or less extractive, right? You're soliciting for information, you're giving out surveys, you're doing focus groups, you're holding town halls, right? And you're trying to get a sense of what the community wants, which is great. But often for equity programs, now you're typically focusing on thought leaders within these respective communities that you're trying to reach, that are probably juggling, 10 other obligations from, other organizations that want their insight and opinion too, and not really compensating these individuals for that emotional, mental, physical labor. So to create small programs to demonstrate that the county local government, I view it from the county, but that local government can be a trusted partner and can, provide resources in addition to just asking for information, I think can go a long way to building that trust. And then also figuring out how to best support these nonprofits, these organizations that are so closely tied to the communities that they serve. to actually, get out the word about COVID vaccines, right? Or share information about access to certain resources that you're trying to disseminate, right? This information that you're trying, usually with great difficulty, to reach a broad audience. Nonprofits can go a long way in building that ability to access those communities.
Yes, and in support of that, I agree with her 100%. Like, we need to have those government support nonprofits that do that kind of advocacy, but also we have to encourage the nonprofits themselves and find ways that the funders evaluate nonprofits based on like long-term and immediate impact. So I know of a couple local efforts that are doing surveys, and I am in a couple of those as well. And so we do like wide scale surveys, but as you're asking people, like, tell me about these issues, why not beforehand connect with local organizations who provide these kind of solutions? Sometimes it's as simple as, if we're talking about public housing and housing health, if you know that person doesn't have a smoke detector or doesn't have like the window seals and all that, like that kid, but there's lots of nonprofits out there that provide this kind of help, and they might not know how to access it, may not know about the reference. And it's not enough to just tell them, here's a list of organizations you can go sift through after you've already completed this long hour survey, and sift through this next. You have to, it'd be great if there's a relationship already. You have their address, you have their name, with their permission, refer them to these organizations and make sure that those organizations are following through.
Yeah, I love how you're pointing out, the investment in physical infrastructure, right? Whether it's things that we think of as fancy new technology like Tesla batteries or, rooftop solar, like these things are important. But equally or more important, we need investment in other kinds of infrastructure, and that includes nonprofits and local organizations, and that's especially key as we face uncertainty, as we face climate change disruptions, that we need strong networks at that local level that can make sure that the resources are getting to people who need them, whether it's, vaccinations or housing and, weatherization that we know, is really essential in preparing for energy challenges that we face. The more we can have energy efficiency and weatherization and good quality housing, that's a huge thing. But it takes a lot of work to be on the ground working in communities and to build that trust to make that stuff happen.
I want to use what I learned in Puerto Rico. So when we went to the school in Puerto Rico, we had lots of meetings with the president of the school, with the principal, with people within the school before we started the program. So we had like this, we had a relationship, right, with the players. So when we got to this school, there had been another NGO had put a solar system on the roof of the school. They didn't communicate with anyone, and it didn't work, and no one knew how to fix it, right? So someone had given, but they didn't, it was easy to do the mechanics. It was hard to do the community work, right? And for me personally, I love the mechanics, but I love the interaction with the human beings. I also had a great partner in Black and Beach, and they knew better, right? They were like, when you do these things, you have to have community buy-in, right? Everyone within the community has to buy in. They have to know how to do it. So we did the installation. We showed people how to use it. We had a big dinner. We had a potluck afterwards for like the christening, right? So everybody's working on it. I go away. 18 months later, last year, there was another hurricane. I called the school to say, hey, my suggestion to you is take half the solar panels off, put them in the shipping container, leave the other half on. If they get destroyed, that's fine. You have the other half to put back on. And I suggested that to the principal of the school. I didn't really hear anything back. And I was really disappointed because I thought, oh my God, we did all this work. It'll get destroyed again. I mean, you're looking at maybe an hour and a half or 2 hours worth of work to stabilize this thing. And then because I'm watching the hurricane, all of a sudden my phone dings. The solar system went down about 5 hours before the hurricane hit. I thought, oh, they must have killed the power to it, or I don't know what happened. It wasn't normal the way it shut down. I was pretty disappointed. 2 or 3 days after, it comes back to life, and I get a call. So what had happened was one of the students' parents was an electrician. He came, took off the solar panels, put them back in the box. The hurricane came through. It wasn't that bad. Came back, put them back on. Why did he do that? Right? He knew that if this school lost power again, his children would be stuck, right, at his house, not going to school. But he also, right, we had that community buy-in. Everybody knew how to fix it. And I guarantee the guy was getting pressure from, it's just community buy-in. So what I take that back to is it's the same way with what we're trying to create for disaster relief in Sioux City, Iowa, in Ankeny, Iowa. People have buy-in. They understand how everything works, right? It's not just FM is the word, blank magic, right? Everyone understands. The way you understand is you're trained, right? And that's part of the community. And I think that's really important to work on, that all of these components, everyone understands. And the way you learn is by having community involvement. Well, how does this work, right? And I believe that helps to fall on institutions like yourself to say, hey, we're going to have a community disaster program, like a bunch of what ifs. And these are the systems. This is what we're going to meet. This is what we're going to do, right? And that's the community. And that's really important that we do that. And it creates good community and goodwill amongst each other. It gets you out of your bubble, right? And gets you learning other things. And I think that's awesome. And I think that is every bit as important as the hardware, right? What you're talking about is software. What I'm talking about is hardware. And they go together, right? They have to go together.
Yeah, and I'll just add, we talked about the value of distributed power, right? And, I think it's a double entendre. It's power in terms of, actual electricity power, right? But also power in decision making, right? And I think that is equally as important, again, tying back to the social infrastructure, but not only giving, but also empowering, right? These communities, these thought leaders to be the actual decision makers on the ground in real time, right? And that structure can't be developed in a time of crisis, right? It definitely has to be something that in addition to the physical infrastructure that you're planning for, we have to figure out how we can disperse that power and get it to the people who honestly will likely make better decisions just because of how connected and how much they know those communities.
Yeah, this last question is, you kind of touched upon it, but I, would like to hear what you have, on any recommendations or ideas that you have on how individuals can do, as well as organizations like the Iowa Environmental Council or local clean energy businesses like SunCrate can do to help better prepare for the kind of uncertainties that we're facing, and where do you see opportunities of engagement for these for these individuals or groups or businesses?
I would say let's go to the hardware side. On the hardware side, we need to go to the utility commission and to the utilities to make sure that they know, right, this is a priority and this is the direction we want to go, right? Don't get me wrong, I love wind turbines. Wind turbines are great. They're awesome, right? But we should also have infrastructure that is resilient. And the way you do it is to have batteries and solar panels at people's homes, right? At the point of use, right? That is very important, right? Not just giant fields of them, not just mega, right? So, and the way that changes is convincing the utility commission that that's a good idea. And that's an institution that is basically a political institution, because the people on the committee are the governor. I'm pretty sure the governor picks them, right? And we need to say, hey, this is really important, and we want you to put this to the front of the line. And that's on the hardware. That's how I think we move the dial the quickest. On the software, I don't know. I won't lie to you. I don't understand how you create communities the best way. And I don't know. I'll tip my hat to you and your expertise. And, when there's a local community meeting, I'll go, right, to say, how do we do it? But, being a community builder, that's a special thing, right? But if you have a whole group of people saying, we want this, it's really important. And I guess what I'm saying is it's viable. It's time, right? If you would have come to me 10 years ago and said, hey, let's do this, I would have said you just, what you're asking for doesn't exist. We can't do it, right? So don't waste your time. But I am saying, as someone that I think of myself as an expert, whether I am or I'm not, that's to be determined. But as a guy that thinks he's an expert, it's time. Like, we're ready, and we're ready for the, for the people to stand up and say, we want this. This works. It's financially viable, and it's moving the right direction where it's becoming cheaper and better all the time. So, and also you got to remember, we're trying to steer a battleship, right? Or an aircraft carrier. The decisions that if you have a grassroots and you go and to make the decision for actual change to happen, when you see it happen, 60 months is not unrealistic to think. 48 months, right? It really isn't. I'm just saying, 48 months to go. So we need to be turning the ship right now, right? We need to be pushing at it. And so I'm glad you're working on it.
I'm a big go to city council meetings, go to board of supervisor meetings person. Each meeting has a public comment section. It might not seem, and I feel like certainly to me, before I got super involved in activist work, it didn't seem like that was as important as it actually is. And sometimes it's honestly not, which is really disheartening. But regardless, you need to make noise. You need to make good trouble. And I think that going to those council meetings, making your case again and again and again, is exactly what everyone should be doing, and what our democratic process wants us to do. And so I think Rompot is a great example of recently and locally in Cedar Rapids with the Cargill Railroad, but that's a great example of it not working, but it still matters, right? Because people see that, I see that, and I think I would have done that differently. I would have made a different decision. And that is inspiring to other nonprofits, to other people considering running for office, to other community organizations, whatever. That is inspiring and pushing change. It might not get you the direct result that you were hoping for, but it's contributing to the cause, and seeing that as valuable, I think is so important for a lot of us who feel like we don't have power now.
What about you, Cristina?
I think for sure one of the things that I've come to realize is really looking at the mission and the vision that you might have, either as personally or as an organization. So personally, environmental justice being one of my biggest areas of interest, especially for youth. So I'm interested in engaging Latino, Black, and Indigenous communities around environmental justice advocacy, but not just that, because I've personally experienced that as starting way back 12 years ago, and have seen that we see as directors and like top executive directors and top staff in the environmental movement being white community members, but those who are mostly impacted by environmental injustice and disaster inequities are low-income people of color. So to me, it's not just about, like Tamara said, having our already taxed youth and people of color to solve issues all the time, especially not in a volunteering structure only, because the fact is that environmental injustice happens at the intersection of race and class and environment. So we can't just have them volunteer in environmental organizations without giving them direct paths to things like work, paid internships. And that's what I would highly ask organizations who have interns, whether it's nonprofits or businesses, really hire paid interns, low income and people of color, because they will be fighting for environmental justice. They are the backbone of a lot of these movements, but that change could be happening faster. They were provided support. And I think we often think of youth as just being really passionate and having all this energy to burn and like great ideas, but the nonprofits benefit from that in a way that, especially for low-income community, is not necessarily equitable. So that's one of my biggest things that I am very passionate about. And anyone who's watching this right now, if you are a youth, a person of color who's interested in environmental justice, going into a career in this area or doing research, going to grad school or master's or advocacy, please reach out to me. I think my Twitter handle is Cristina Muñoz E. And I think this is similar for my LinkedIn, or if there's any way that my contact information can show up, just please feel free to reach out to me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cristina and Tamara and Dolf. We will definitely include your contact information at the end of the conversation in a final slide. But yeah, I wanted to, kind of bring back our conversation and, want to thank everyone, all of the panelists for highlighting all these different issues. Definitely, the physical and social infrastructure that has to be centered on equity and making sure that, our planning processes really focus on that aspect.
Thanks to everybody for being part of this panel. As somebody who is, executive director of a nonprofit who does identify as a white man, I really appreciate the ways that you're helping me learn, and that I think it's really vital for in my work to listen and learn, develop new relationships and trust. To not be extractive in the ways that we work as an organization, whether it's with young people or professionals like the two of you. So yeah, I hope we can continue this conversation and this work together. We are very committed to building up the power of young people, communities of color, other organizations that we can partner with around the state at the local level. Because I think we know that state level and federal level policies are important, that the investment in physical infrastructure and energy technologies are important, but ultimately this work is about building power in the way that Tamara was talking about, really empowering communities at that very grassroots level, and that has to happen through sharing our stories, sharing our experiences, learning from mistakes, and the kind of practice that Tamara was talking about, getting involved in local issues, showing up to meetings, and there's going to be mistakes along the way. There's going to be issues where we are frustrated with the lack of progress, but the more we practice at that, the stronger our advocacy, and that's the building up of the social infrastructure, that very process, even if it sometimes feels like it's not there yet. I think the more we practice at that together, the better we get. So I really appreciate you modeling that for me and for our audience today. If people are interested in getting involved, they can connect with Iowa Environmental Council, 100% Iowa, and we'll put you in touch with all the great work that these individuals are doing. Thanks so much.